Okay, so the Camtasia recording is going, and I'm going to start the Jigsaw recording just for... Okay. Alright, the Jigsaw recording is counting down. Let me do that and this. Akila, can you tell me if you can see the PowerPoint and it's big on the screen? Alright, so tonight what I'm going to talk about is the executive branch. Our 6-week folks are going to be covering the executive branch later on this week. 5-week folks, you may still be catching up, but this will serve you as the weeks go on. So the executive branch. Well, I want to start off by asking a question, and Akila, sorry, you're the only one here, but what does it take to be a good president? What does it take? If you had to name one thing that it takes to be a great president, what would it be? Good leadership skills. Yes, well, and mainly because this person is going to be the leader of the free world. So, yes, you're absolutely right. Good leadership skills are important. If we look here at our U.S. presidents, they have all been male. Most of them have been Protestant. Only one Catholic, if I remember correctly, and that was John F. Kennedy Jr. Most of British ancestry. Most college educated, but not all, if you can see that. Most are also politicians, but not all. Okay. 62% of the presidents that we've had were lawyers. Top 3% in wealth and social class, because I think that it's no surprise that it takes money in order to become president. And almost 70% were elected from very large states. Well, why large states? Because they have most of the electoral votes, like California and New York. So, do you want to answer these, Akila? Sorry, you're the only one here. So, do you know who the youngest president ever was? Or do you know the oldest president? Or who held the presidency for the longest time? Or the shortest time? Do you want to answer any of these questions, Akila? Well, that's a really good answer because he was president and then ran for president again at a later time. But actually, he was not the youngest president. The youngest president was JFK, John F. Kennedy Jr. Yeah. The oldest person to ever be president was Ronald Reagan. Presidency for the longest time, cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He held it for 4 terms. That was before they changed it through constitutional amendment to make a presidential term no longer than 2 terms or 10 years. William Henry Harrison has the record for the shortest presidency. His was 32 days. He was only in office about a month after his inauguration. He caught the flu while giving his inauguration speech and died in office. And a person must be born in the United States or be naturally born in the United States in order to become president. A little bit of trivia. So here in the next couple of slides, I've got some quotes by presidents. The first one by Harry Truman. And these are quotes of presidents talking about the presidency. And really, as much as we like to judge presidents on what they're doing or not doing, really the only people who can know for certain the position, the job, is an ex-president. So here Harry Truman says, "I sit here all day trying to persuade people to do things they ought to have the sense to do without me persuading them. That's all the powers of the president amount to." Okay. JFK, John F. Kennedy Jr. says, "No easy problem ever comes to the President of the United States. If they are easy to solve, somebody else has to solve them." LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, said, "The presidency has made every man who occupied it, no matter how small, bigger than he was, and no matter how big, not big enough for its demands." And then a couple of more right here. I actually could have found a better picture of George W. Bush. But the first one from Nixon, which is really what got Nixon in trouble. Nixon was our only U.S. president to resign. Okay, so Nixon said, "Under the doctrine of separation of powers, the manner in which the president personally exercises his assigned executive powers is not subject to questioning by another branch of the government." Well, actually it is, which is the reason why President Nixon had to resign rather than become impeached or charged with a criminal crime and be jailed. But he ended up resigning, and then the person who took his place gave him a pardon, so he didn't have to serve any time. And then the last one, "To those of you who received honors and awards and distinctions, I say, well done. To the C students, I say, you too can be President of the United States." It's no secret that George W. Bush was about a C student at Yale, an Ivy League school where he went. So what does the president's, schedule look like? I hope you can somewhat read this. So the president has a very jam-packed schedule, and every minute of every day is recorded. Okay, and it's there's no lag time or no time where it's not documented what the president is doing. And so you can see here from the time the president wakes up in the morning until he retires, goes to bed, everything that he does is recorded. So what we're going to do is talk about the roles and responsibilities of the president. So here's the executive branch, and at a glance, the executive branch enforces the law, the president being the executive. This is described in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. The executive power should be vested in a president of the United States of America. He shall hold his office during the term of 4 years, and together with the vice president chosen for the same team, be elected as follows. So what are the perks of being president? There's got to be something, right? Well, maybe not. Makes about $400,000 a year. That's tax-free money. Has about a $50,000 expense account, about $100,000 in travel expenses. He gets to live in the White House. He has Secret Service protection up to 10 years after leaving office. He has a country home at Camp David. He has a personal airplane, Air Force One. He has a staff of about 400 to 500 full-time employees. So, yeah, that's pretty good, right? And like I said before, the qualifications for becoming president, it doesn't say that he has to, president has to be a male. Females can be president. We just haven't had one. But they do have to be natural-born citizens. They have to have lived in the United States for at least 14 years. Must be at least 35 years old. They are restricted to a 4-year term, eligible for re-election one time. It was President Washington who set the precedent for serving 2 terms, and with the 22nd Amendment, this was made law. So what kind of powers does the president have? The president serves as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He can authorize troops overseas without declaring war. He needs approval through Congress to make an actual declaration of war. The president is able to make treaties with other nations. We saw this just recently with Kim Jong-un, the Korean dictator, commander, high chief, whatever you want to call him, leader of that country. President Trump made a deal. And by the way, that's not him right there in that. It's President Trump, but it's not Kim Jong-un in that picture. That's the Chinese premier. The president can also nominate ambassadors and also receives ambassadors like the Chinese premier right there and recognizes them as being leaders of official countries. So the legislative powers, the president presents information on the State of the Union to Congress. He can recommend legislation to Congress. He can call Congress into special sessions. Approves laws passed by Congress. And he has the power of veto, which is one of the checks and balances. One of the checks on the legislative branch. He also has administrative powers. It is the president's duty to take care that the laws will be faithfully executed, which is a part of Article 2, Section 3. He can make appointments. For example, appoint new court justice to the Supreme Court. This is in agreement with the legislature or the Senate. Okay, that's another check. That's a check on the Senate, actually. And he can also approve laws that are written by Congress. The presidential powers include judicial powers. He grants and reprieves pardons for federal crimes. If you are aware, President Trump just pardoned an individual who was serving time for a crime, a lady who had been serving 21 years. The president pardoned her and she was immediately set free. He can appoint federal judges. Like I said, this is with the agreement of the Senate. So what are his roles, our president? Well, he's chief of state. He's the ceremonial head of government, of the United States government. Whereas if you go to England, then the Queen is the ceremonial head of the country. But our president is also the chief executive of the federal government. And so the president can issue executive orders. For example, President Truman issued an executive order to abolish segregation in the military back in late 40s. Late 40s, about 48, I think. The president is also manager of the economy. He works with Congress to write the federal budget. He sets tax policy. He works to control the money supply and keep the economy growing. He's the chief diplomat. Okay? The main architect of American foreign policy. Chief spokesperson to the rest of the world. He is the commander-in-chief. He's in charge of the armed forces. He controls the military, has ultimate responsibility for military decisions. There are about 2.7 million men and women in our voluntary armed forces, and that maintain the nation's entire military arsenal. These are all subject to the president's direct and immediate control. He's the chief legislature, policymaker, main architect of domestic policy or public policy. He can initiate, suggest, request, insist, demands that Congress enact legislation. He sets the all-over shape of the congressional agenda. So he's the chief of the party. He's chief of the political party. In this case, President Trump is the leader of the Republican Party. And he is the chief citizen. He's the representative of all American people. So which one of these, Akila, would you say are the most important? Of all the roles that the president has, which do you think are most important? Do you have any guesses as to which one do you think would be most important? Well, I would agree with you. Controlling the armed forces is a very important role, being commander-in-chief, an important power that the president has. It's a huge responsibility as well. You have a lot of soldiers serving in the armed forces, and so if those soldiers, the lives of those soldiers are really in the hands of the executive. Good job. So, continuing with the executive branch, the line of succession, if something were to happen to the president, he's unable to serve as specified in the Constitution, then the vice president would be the next in line. After the vice president, it would go to the Speaker of the House, and then the President pro tem of the Senate, and then the different cabinet offices like Secretary of State. And then this line, starting with the Secretary of State, it continues with each of the 14 heads of the cabinet departments in the order in which their offices were created by Congress. So what is the federal government? Well, federal government is largely made up of a bureaucracy, a large, complex administrative structure that handles the business of the federal government. Federal government is the largest organization in the country. It consists of the four main groups seen here: the White House staff, the executive office, executive departments, and independent agencies. So the government at all levels grew enormously during the 20th century. reason being society has become more complex. In recent years, there's been a big push to cut down size, to deregulate, especially during the Reagan administration, which also could have been the possible cause of the economic crisis. Obama had the largest unfunded expansion of government in history. So bureaucrats are also known as paper pushers. These are employees of the government units. Most work for the federal government that are hired under the requirements of civil service. Appointments to the federal bureaucracy are filled based on the basis of merit. Employees are not fired for political reasons. This creates a nonpartisan workforce. In other words, if you're working for the federal government and you feel one way, you lean more Democrat or Republican, you're not going to get fired for your political beliefs. So here's the hierarchy of the federal bureaucracy. The president is at the top, then the vice president, the White House staff, the executive office of the president, the cabinet, and then the independent agencies. So the executive branch is really more than just the president. So here is a layout of what is known as the West Wing. You can see that the residence of the White House, I don't know if I have is this mine? No. Oh no. I don't know what I did. Hold on. Okay, we're back. I don't know what I did there, but here is the White House, and then the West Wing is where the president's office is, and most of the White House staff consists of about 400 people. The chief of staff is the most loyal aide, the gatekeeper who controls who talks to the president and who does not. Also, the chief of staff will provide guidance on and advice on issues. The executive office of the president consists of agencies and individuals who help him perform specialized tasks. It's about 1,800 members. The members include the White House staff, the Office of Management and Budget, National Security, and the National Economic Council. The cabinet is not mentioned in the Constitution, but it's probably the best known organization of the executive branch. It's a group of advisors to the president that the president appoints by Congress. They're appointed by the president, and then Congress has to confirm them or agree to them. So there are 15 departments today, and I have a little graphic right there showing you those 15 departments that make up the president's cabinet. The federal government is our nation's largest employer. You might not believe that, but it's true. A lot of people work to help run the federal government. And here's another graphic that shows not only the executive office of the president, but the White House staff, the independent agencies, and then down at the bottom, the executive departments, to include agriculture, commerce, all the way down to Veterans Affairs. So how does one become president? Well, first thing they do is they announce their candidacy. And then they work towards making themselves available and aware by the public. Fundraising, developing a platform. The next step is to move through the primaries or the caucuses. These are political meetings in which determines which candidates for president will be supported by the state and by the national convention for each political party. Then you have a national convention. That's the third step. It's held by both parties, and it's where they determine who will receive the nomination for that party. The fourth step is the general election. This is where we go to vote. usually between Democrats and Republicans, but also could include a third party. It's always held on the first Tuesday of November. And then the fifth step and final step is the Electoral College vote. So the Electoral College is a group of persons that are chosen in each state and in Washington every 4 years to make a formal selection of the president. The candidate that receives the majority of votes in a state receives all of that state's Electoral College votes. And so here's a map of the Electoral College. The number of Electoral College votes a state gets is based on population. So you can see that a state like California, which has 55 electoral votes, certainly has more people in California than, say, Georgia, which only has 15 electoral votes. Okay? Small states like Hawaii and Alaska, they have 4 and 3 votes respectively. So the 2008 election, this is the election between President Barack Obama and John McCain. This is how the electoral votes panned out, with the red states going to McCain, the blue states going to President Barack Obama. Okay? So you can kind of see how each state votes. There's only 270 electoral votes needed to win, so you can see that Barack Obama clearly had a victory. So the Electoral College is not a perfect system. It is possible for the winner of the popular vote not to win the presidency. It can be very close. It can even be tied. Nothing forces a state's electors to vote for the candidate who wins the state's popular vote. But it is very uncommon for a state's elector to not vote for the candidate that is chosen for that state. A strong third-party candidate could win enough votes to prevent any candidate from winning. So the point of having an electoral college is the framers of the Constitution created it as a compromise, considering the elections of the president. They initially had the president elected by Congress and then state lectures, but finally election by the people, even considered at one time a popular vote. But they feared by doing this a tyrant could manipulate public opinion and come to power. So essentially, the founding fathers had a lack of trust in the people and felt like it needed a more educated group of people to actually select the president. So who are these electors? Well, they're often party loyalists and activists from the states, party leaders, or somehow connected to the president. People's vote. Well, the popular vote doesn't. That's a good question, Akila. The popular vote isn't really taken into consideration. The only vote that counts is the Electoral College vote. And there have been instances where the Electoral College vote is for one candidate, but the popular vote is for another candidate. And the reason for that is when people go to vote in the general election, most states say that if one candidate gets a majority of the votes or most of the votes, then they get all of the votes for that entire state. And so you can have situations where a candidate will have a lot of people voting for them, but those votes, in a sense, are not counted in the Electoral College. Sort of happened that way with the 2000 election, with the election of George W. Bush and Al Gore. Mostly what happened here, though, was there were questions. It was so close in the state of Florida, and you can see Florida right down there on the little magazine page. Florida had 25 votes, and so both of these candidates came very close to reaching the 270 mark that was needed. So it really came down to Florida. Was Florida going to give its 25 electoral votes to George W. Bush, or were they going to give it to Al Gore? Well, that depends on how people voted in Florida. And what usually happens is on election night, the votes start coming in, and then once one candidate gets a majority, they go ahead and call that state for that candidate. However, what happened on this night, it was what was called too close to call. The polls closed. They were starting to count the votes for Al Gore and then counting the votes also for George W. Bush. And every time they counted them, they were pretty much neck and neck. They pretty much had the same number. So nobody could say for sure whether Florida's 25 electoral votes were going to go for which candidate. And it was actually, the election happened in November. It was in December. Closer almost to Christmas before we were actually figured out that Florida was going to go with George W. Bush. There were questions about how the voting occurred. There were some candidates, voting places that used an old, antiquated way of voting where you actually take a paper ballot and punch a card. But the cards sometimes didn't line up right, and so you wouldn't really vote for Al Gore or George W. Bush. It kind of landed somewhere in the middle, and people said, well, okay, well, what did that vote count towards? And nobody could really answer it, but then they were going to throw him out, but then they said that was wrong too. It was a mess. It was a real mess. And at the end of the day, what actually happened was nobody really knows for sure that George W. Bush won Florida. Florida just decided they were going to give their votes to the state secretary of Florida. Decided that the state's votes, electoral college votes, would go to George W. Bush. So, but Al Gore, as the polls came in, was clearly winning the popular vote. So Al Gore, very much could have become our president, but he didn't. George W. Bush was for 2 terms. He was president. This is the Electoral College vote for the 2000 election. And you can see these Florida, 25 Florida Electoral College votes. And those are the ones that flipped over. The thing about it, though, is usually a candidate will carry their own state. In other words, get votes from their own state. For example, President Trump, his state is New York. And so when New York voted, I believe, I can't remember if New York went for Trump or not. But anyway, let's take Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was from Georgia, and Georgia, citizens voted for Jimmy Carter, and so he carried his own state. My point in this is Al Gore was from Tennessee, and looking at this map, you can see that the blue states are the wins for Al Gore, but the red states are the wins for George W. Bush. And as you can see, Al Gore did not even get a win from his own state, which is really, it's unusual for that to happen. And actually, had he won his own state, he would have been president. Al Gore would have. So that's unfortunate. George W. Bush was from Texas, so he had no problem getting his home state. So here's the breakdown of the Electoral College. We vote, the people vote for electors. The electors vote for the president, and then the president, with 270 electoral votes, wins the presidency. Okay, Akila, that ends my PowerPoint presentation. Did you have any questions about our assignments coming up? All right, well, if you'll just hang on real quick, I do want to, oh gosh, hold on, I'm not prepared. Okay, what I'd like to do is reduce this, and then share, share, share. Show my desktop. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing my desktop now. I think I'm still. Oh, this thing can be persnickety sometimes. Are you able to see my desktop, Akila? Okay. I did just want to, real quick, let you know that all right, so what's due today? Legislative branch project for the 5-week students National State Powers Quiz. Okay, make sure I'm listing every day, at least in my class. I don't know if Ms. Irving is doing this, but in my class I'm listing each day what is due. So hopefully you're taking a look at that. Okay, and also your 5-week and 6-week schedules right here. So let me know if you have any questions. If you don't have any more questions for me, then you're free to go. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the desktop. So I just say thank you for coming. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and cut off the recording.